Hey juniors, I guess I should say A-Push gang. So we're gonna try this. Mr. Selby, I think, is your subs today. And so he is gonna be navigating the technology or asking for your help if he can't figure it out, but I'm guessing he'll probably be able to figure it out. So I'm going to do a finishing crash course on Chapter 5 and the American Revolution. I did look through the Chapter 5 quiz. There's some tricky questions in there, so don't be too upset if you don't do as well as you have been doing, because I think these questions are a little tougher. I took the quiz myself without looking at the key and struggled to figure out the answer to some of them. So do the best that you can. Go ahead and grade the quizzes. This will be at the end of class today. And then give them to Mr. Selby, and then I will evaluate them. If there's some questions that are just wonky, then we'll deal with that. So don't get too stressed out about that. Don't leave Friday and head into the weekend with angst about that. So they're just really hard questions, and it's been a while since we've taken a regular AP quiz. The last quiz that we had was the one that I created, and they're just not as difficult as the A-Push quizzes. So anyway, yesterday, or no, I guess Wednesday, which is today, which is when I'm recording this, we did kind of a crash course through the first half of the American Revolution. And so after looking at the quiz, I want to kind of back up just a smidgen and review a couple of things. I'm going to leave a copy of this sheet for you. Oh, I pulled up the wrong one. Let's see here. There it is. I'm going to give you a copy of this. It says period 3, chapter 5, review terms for the quiz. Ignore the part about for the quiz. I actually never mind what I just said. So these will help you on the quiz that you're about to take, although this was not written, I don't think, for that quiz, but that's neither here nor there. So I'm going to zip through these pretty quickly and then jump back into the American Revolution. I want to make sure you guys know what salutary neglect is. It was the practice of the British of ignoring their navigation laws because it benefited them to do so. So they neglected their laws, and people became accustomed to not having to adhere to the laws. It would be similar to something like we talked about, that if the speed limit through Centerton was 35 miles per hour, but for decades, nobody ever enforced that, and so everybody just became accustomed to driving 50 through there. And then one day, the city of Centerton decided that they wanted to raise some revenue, and so they began enforcing the speed limit and began giving tickets to raise revenue for the city of Centerton. It would make people angry because a law that is not enforced, unfortunately, human nature is to take advantage of that, and that's what the merchants and the shipping companies in the Americas were doing. Britain had these laws. They were ignoring those laws because financially they were benefiting from the colonies' trade with other countries. But as England became more and more entangled in foreign wars and taxes were being raised on the English people on the island, England began to look towards its North American colonies for a source of tax revenue, and they began to enforce those laws. So that's what salutary neglect is. Ultimately, at the end of the French and Indian War, there was a much larger war debt incurred, and so the British felt they had to begin to enforce those navigation laws and whatnot. So another complication to the French and Indian War, of course, was the fact that North American colonists were feeding over into the Appalachian Mountains on the western portion of those mountains, coming into conflict with some of the Native Americans that had fought in the French and Indian War. The British were already stretched really thin. They were trying to defend the colonists, and ultimately the Proclamation of 1763 drew an imaginary line through the Appalachian Mountains and told the North American colonists that they could not go beyond that, even though many of them already had and were living on the western portions of the shadows of those mountains. And so that really rubbed them wrong. And England also had to raise revenue to pay for those troops that were there. So large presence of British troops in North America for a variety of reasons, enforcing the navigation laws, enforcing custom duties, protecting the colonists from native enemies. And so that created kind of a cauldron which exploded when the British began to issue various taxes of sorts. So on this piece of paper, the first act that's got listed is the Sugar Act of 1764. That was the one that was attempting to tax the molasses from the French West Indies. And so I believe this was a question on your publisher's quiz, but they actually lowered the tax, thinking that would lure people into it, but part of the other parts of the law included clauses that allowed colonists to be tried in courts of admiralty, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, which took them out of the local courts and into an English court where they were less likely to be found not guilty. And a few other things that enforced some of the smuggling laws and that sort of thing. So, so while it lowered the taxes on molasses, it increased the penalties for smuggling and other things. Let's see here. The Stamp Act, which was a direct tax because you physically paid for a stamp that would adhere to whatever the paper product was that you were purchasing. So you were paying a tax to purchase the little stamp to show that you had paid the tax. So it's a direct tax. It happens at transaction. Our sales tax is a sort of a direct tax because you are not taxed unless you purchase something. And so when you purchase something, you pay a sales tax, which goes to the state revenue office. Ultimately, through the course of boycotts and that sort of thing, boycotts generally work the best. The merchants of England encouraged Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. I think I read that not a single stamp was even sold in North America. In fact, there were people who were supposed to enforce merchants and colonist adherence to this boycott. I don't know how successful it was, and I'm not sure if it was, now that I'm thinking about it, I can't remember if it was specifically the Stamp Act. I think it was. Anyway, Parliament did repeal the Stamp Act, but in its place, it replaced it with the Declaratory Act, which said, we're going to repeal this tax because our merchants aren't very happy with us, but we still retain the right to tax you, even though you are not represented, because we virtually represent you. We represent all the people of the English kingdom, the English empire. Let's see here. The Stamp Act Congress was an intricate part of that. Delegates from the various colonies met to discuss ways to get this repealed, and it was successful. The expression "no taxation without representation" was born during this particular crisis. My understanding is that it was a slogan of sorts developed or directed by the Sons of Liberty. I don't know if that's urban legend. I've read that in a couple different places, so I'm going to go for it. And the Stamp Act Congress was the first coordinated action against the British by the colonies. And let's see here, the Townshend Acts. Charles Townshend, I can't remember if he was the prime minister or the finance minister, but Charles Townshend said, okay, it's time to raise some more revenue. We got to figure something else out. And so this was a little bit of a slower bleed. The colonists were not quite as reactionary to this particular tax. It took place a couple of years later. And that's in part because it was an import tax. So it wasn't felt as directly as the Stamp Act was. And it was a tax on lead, glass, and a whole bunch of manufacturing items that could not be manufactured in the colonies. So these were things that were being imported that had to be imported because we didn't make them here. We didn't manufacture them here. So lead and glass, some paper products, some other things, but these are things that we could not get our hands on here. They were things we had to pay, that we had to import. You don't think about paper as being a commodity, but it truly was a precious commodity. And so the book talks about a pamphlet written by John Dickinson, Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. Dickinson is the guy in the John Adams movie who fought against the independence movement. In this particular case, he was fighting against the boycotts and calling for reconciliation with the British. We know what homespun virtue is. The Townshend Acts really culminated in an increased level of British troops in specifically the Boston area, which then leads to the Boston Massacre. So you have tensions are high because the Crown has sent troops to the New England, Boston area where a lot of this boycott, the taxes talk is happening. And so the British want to kind of squash that rebellion, and so they send troops into Boston, which just intensifies the already problematic situation. These troops are living in people's homes. Sometimes they knock on the door and say, we're going to use your house. You'll have to find somewhere else to stay. That's, of course, a violation of the English Bill of Rights. You can't just quarter troops during peacetime in somebody's home. But there was no resolution. There was no way to get around this when you were a colonist in the North American colonies. There was no recourse is the word I'm looking for. Ultimately, the East India Trading Company was going bankrupt, and the Crown came up with this idea to exclusively sell the tea that the East India Trading Company had excess of and send it over to various cities in North America. I believe that the governor of Boston or of Massachusetts was the only governor that allowed the ships to come into port. The other cities rejected them, but the governor of Massachusetts was appointed by the Crown, and he was the Crown's man, and this created an uproar, of course, which leads to the Boston Tea Party, and the Intolerable Acts, also called the Coercive Acts, which shut down the harbor, and basically said, this harbor is closed until you guys figure out how you're going to pay back all this money. At the same time that happened, Parliament also passed the Quebec Act, and I don't think we talked about this in class, and this is kind of important. Back in that era, there was still a lot of angst between the Catholics and the Protestants. The argument that Catholics would always answer to the Pope rather than to an elected authority or even a monarch. And so there was a lot of anti-popery, as they say. And the Quebec Act dealt with the territory of Quebec in Canada that England had acquired, I think as a result of the French and Indian War. And essentially it went easy on the Catholics there, gave them the right to practice their Catholicism the way they wanted to without much pushback from the Crown. In fact, the book says that the Catholics of Canada were treated and their rights were much more protected than Catholics who actually lived on the island of England or Great Britain. The colonists of North America, the 13 colonies, were aghast at this. They felt like this was intentional by the Crown to scare them and to threaten them, and to support the Catholicism that so many of them found, what's the word? They were afraid of it. And so, so the Quebec Act